The recent release from OpenAI of function calling in their API has been a godsend to the developers out there who have been basically struggling, like myself, which I'll get into soon, to get ChatGPT to respond in a particular manner. And in most developers' cases, it is trying to get ChatGPT to respond in JSON, which, I mean, relatively speaking, relative to like a year ago, it's pretty freaking good. But seeing as how ChatGPT can now interface almost seamlessly and effortlessly with plugins, it makes you question where is that functionality for the developers. So it basically just arrived, and it came in the form of function calling. So before I get into my application, ChatGPT Tutor, I'm gonna do a quick recap of what function calling is. So calling adds basically two things to API, which I'm not going to get into too much detail as this is just a high level overview. Um, but the way it works is basically you pass in functions which can be proxied as um, ChatGPT plugins, and in these functions you just describe how you want ChatGPT to respond to you, and it's going to respond to you in a JSON format with the arguments that you request here, like in this case, location and unit, and it's going to return a JSON with location and unit, which then you can pass back into ChatGPT, which is done here, which is done here. Um, you can pass it back into ChatGPT with the actual response, whatever you do with that JSON, and then process it, run it through the function or run it through an API, and basically return the results of that, and then ChatGPT summarizes it into a natural language response. So in this case, it returns something like the weather in Boston is currently 22 degrees Celsius. And that's basically the idea behind function calling. So why am I excited? Why are developers everywhere so excited about this? The very simple reason is that formerly getting ChatGPT to respond to you in a structured JSON format, which has a ton of applications in the development space, was a pain in the butt. And although ChatGPT is like 95% of the way there, 95% is not nearly consistent enough to basically include it into an actual production scenario. So, what function calling allows us to do is basically ensure that ChatGPT is going to respond in a JSON format every single time, and that is big. Just to give you an idea of how this all works and like the major differences this could have in development, I'm gonna demonstrate how I updated um, my project, which is an npm package called ChatGPT Tutor, and how I integrated function calling into it. So let me introduce what ChatGPT Tutor is. So currently you can see it for yourself in KCrusher slash ChatGPT Tutor. You can implement it. It's already in a very stable state. I've done pretty robust testing as I need to because of ChatGPT's inconsistency. Um, but what ChatGPT Tutor does at a very high level is, well, what its objective is to basically become the de facto standard for any educational organization to um, make their own ChatGPT tutors, which is highly in demand at the moment. And how does ChatGPT Tutor provide that? Currently, it's at a very early stage, but it does provide one very useful feature and one obvious feature as well. The obvious feature, ChatGPT responses. Duh. And the other, I mean, if you're in the space, you know that's obvious too, but it is that implementing this is a lot more challenging. And that what that feature is basically being able to store the context of, let's say, a lesson or a course that you're learning, being able to store that in a vector database, and then being able to serve that back to the student because ChatGPT does not have access to like new content, and it does not have access to some books. So being able to retrieve that data can be chat can well for most cases, it's just not happening. But now with ChatGPT Tutor, you can actually add that to a vector database and ensure that ChatGPT is able to access that information so that it responds to the user with it responds to the student with relevant information. And on top of that, it is all sequential. So if the student is like 3 lessons in, it's not going to fetch for anything on the fourth lesson. So it's only going to return relevant content. And that's the essence of what ChatGPT Tutor is. I did omit one small feature in ChatGPT Tutor, which is kind of small. It's definitely not worth discussing when describing what ChatGPT Tutor is, but it is nonetheless very powerful, and it's something I wanted to experiment with. And what it is, again, at a high level, is it basically transforms something of one JSON format to another JSON format. Let me demonstrate. So here I have an implementation of ChatGPT Tutor. What it's basically doing here, it's initializing the class, then some other stuff is happening, um, and then eventually we're just gonna generate a very basic response. There's no this is as simple as it seems. But if you've been sharp-eyed, you'll notice that this messages that we're passing into the generate response function is not of the type that OpenAI wants it. OpenAI wants it in a different way. And nonetheless, if we run this, you'll see that it works nonetheless. And that is because of this small thing here. You'll notice that a message transformer object is generated. That's what it's telling you here. And basically, it's a JSON object that contains a JSON that contains a key value pair of JavaScript function with the function itself. The JavaScript function that's going to transform something of this unknown schema to the known schema, which is going to be of role, which is going to include two keys, role and content. And it's ChatGPT is going to determine which one the role is and which one the content is, and that's where the magic happens. And also where the backbreaking prompt engineering happened. Um, so where is that happening? Let me demonstrate. So ChatGPT Tutor inside generate response. If it doesn't have a chat transformer, it's gonna run this, the generate message transformer, and this this is a relatively simple method. Outside of the try catch that I created here to compensate for the inconsistency of ChatGTP, which is basically like the it's a whole thing. I can discuss it later, but it's basically a prompt that informs ChatGTP of like the previous conversation and the error that happened, and with the objective of potentially ChatGPT resolving it and fixing it. As you know, developers are doing all the time now. We feed into ChatGPT our development issues, and ChatGPT resolves them for us. So that's basically the idea with this try catch. Whenever it's inconsistent and it fails, this is what happens. But that's besides the point. The point here is the prompt. And what's happening in the prompt is I'm asking for it very explicitly to give me a JavaScript single line arrow function with a string that blah 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 blah. I describe the function in full of how the function is supposed to behave. Then I want the function to basically more information about how I want the function to behave. Afterwards, um, this is basically the line that gets replaced with function calling, which um, which is like, I mean, it's only one line, but this isn't much the problem. The problem is parsing out the response afterwards. So here's just to finish this off. Here's more information. You basically pass it the input example of a message instance of unknown schema, and here is like what the target schema is. So here's like the input schema, which is unknown. Here's the target schema, and that's how it basically used to work. Um, that's the prompt that produces a JSON object. And even though I have this prompt, it sometimes fails. So I still need to parse it, which happens here. And this parsing is sometimes effective, and it wasn't like a very iterative process to get it to be effective. Um, and yeah, basically the parsing and the line that I added in the prompt are the two things that are replaced by the function calling, which seems small, but if you um, working through this is does take a lot of time, and well, time and frustration. So all of that now is alleviated by function calling. So I'm gonna check out to the main repository. Oh my god. In contrast, now the implementation is basically the same. There's just one small difference here where you gotta it's a different parameter, but it's of no influence here. This is related to the vector database, which has nothing to do with the function calling. But it's the same implementation. When we run it, same result. Um, the difference is the actual code behind it. Where now we basically for the generate message transformer. I mean the generate message, that's generate response. This is still the same, and there are there is a slight difference in the generate message transformer in that I don't have the fault tolerance that I had before, where I checked if ChatGTP doesn't work, which is definitely something I could do, but time is limited. I basically omitted that part and carried on with the the creation of the function, which happens here. Here is the signature, the function signature, which includes the details about how the function should behave. There's basically only one. There's only one argument in the function, and there's only one key value pair that's going to be produced in the JSON function, the JSON object, which is going to be this transformer function, which has a bit of prompting in it, where I tell it that I want it to be. Basically, I copied the previous line. I copied the line from the previous version, where I'm describing it very explicitly what I want from the function. Um, that didn't really change. And then this is basically all describing how the function should behave. But I don't have to tell that to return a JSON object, and a JSON object is returned 100% of the time, which is a big deal. Now I don't necessarily need to worry about parsing it. I don't need the infinite try catches to compensate for that. Um, Although that being said, I still added try catch in there just in case something goes wrong and ensure that the product doesn't fall apart. So this is just in case. It hasn't happened yet. I've tried it multiple times, no issues. Has never caught anything. Um, and so that's the function signature. This is basically going to return a JSON object at the end of it. Well, it's going to return a stringified JSON object, which is then basically parsed here. Which again, this is just the same parser as before, just that there's a difference in the naming of the function of the stringified JSON object key, which is transformer underscore function. And that is the newer version. Although from a purely coding standpoint, it isn't dramatically more different than what was previously done, but from a development and stability and fault tolerance standpoint, it is a massive improvement. Whereas in the past, it took me hours to do this. Refactoring it took me no more than 30 minutes. I mean, getting the first iteration together took me maximum 30 minutes. I'll I'll give it an I'll give it another 30 minutes just for cleanup and just cleaning up the code base. But really, it was a lot easier and there was much less troubleshooting. And that is big because, like, for example, I have many other features that I would like to implement that, if not for this feature, I wouldn't undergo the um, I wouldn't undergo the challenge that is developing them. But with this callable functions, it seems a lot more attainable, and I might just pursue them. There's still a couple of things I would like to experiment with regards to function calling in general and function calling in relation to ChatGTP. Where, I mean, to start off, if I need to be if I really need to be so explicit with the JavaScript function description, where the reason it is so, like, narrow and so constrained is because of the fact that I wasn't sure if the JSON would work right. If I, like, for example, if it was multiple lines, sometimes it just wouldn't work. So that's why I needed it to be a single line, and as a result, it had to be an arrow function. I'd be interested in experimenting whether or not I can get away with a more loose JavaScript function. Um, Another thing is basically, this is more general to function calling, which has to do with their documentation. Well, how they intend for it to be used. Although intend is a strong word. I would say it's just an option for how to use it. But here you see basically the exchange of messages, and basically these two messages are both the assistant speaking. And I was just curious if, like, once you get your response here, what are the losses, what are the benefits of including, let's say, this plus these three? How much better is that than basically just including this together with the original user message? So I'd be curious to see what the trade off is there, if these two are really necessary. So that's something else that I'd be curious to find out. And now for the $1 million question: why can't we access the ChatGTP plugins? Say, ask your PDF, show me diagrams, all this stuff. I'm sure some of them are only intended to be used within ChatGTP and they can be private, but you have to wonder what is going on in OpenAI that they chose to start with this more flexible approach to basically ChatGPT plugins on the API, as opposed to being able to call the plugins right away. And the, so one is like the business standpoint. Like, maybe there's some configurations, maybe there's some documentation that they need to, for example, you need to explicitly say whether your extension is public or private, and that can lead to, like, developers, like, I mean, these partnerships, these third party plugins, being slow to respond. Who knows? Um, but yeah, public or privacy, that could be important. Um, but I'm very curious as to why they don't allow us to use these, because, and well, there's that, and then there's the other aspect of, if I were to be developing a plugin, like I've developed these two plugins before, these don't translate. Like, I'm basically gonna have to recreate the logic to get it implemented into my ChatGPT tutor. If I wanted this ideas plugin in here, I would need to create another signature at the very least, and then I would, like, have ChatGPT. No, I need to create a new signature, and I need to create basically a middleware to create fetch requests to the backend that the plugin is running on, and that is a hassle. Um, so if that could be mediated in some way, that would be great. But I frankly just I think that it's primarily just a business decision. And as for merging basically the plugin that's uploaded into ChatGTP, like these, and the plugin that's created locally through the API, I wish there would be a greater overlap between the two, so that I don't have to do that. I don't have to put in so much work if I wanted to get implemented on both. Um, but yeah, those are my thoughts on the current situation of things. But at the end of the day, it's very exciting time to be working with ChatGPT, and I'm definitely gonna be using it a lot more for a lot crazier stuff. So stay tuned for that, and have fun toying around with ChatGPT function calling.